Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome back to Apostolic Islam, representing the faith of the apostles and the prophets of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is the beginning of a series where we investigate the historical figure that is Saul of Tarsus, also known as Paul, the so-called apostle. The controversies surrounding the figure of Paul are not easy to tackle, but we will be doing our best to examine them and give an accurate historical portrayal of his reality. Ask yourself, was he a true apostle of the Messiah, Jesus, son of Mary, or was he an apostle of lies, a man of deception and in opposition to the true disciples of Jesus? The purpose of the series, insha'Allah ta'ala, is to uncover and shed some light on his credibility, truthfulness, and the claims he made. Let's begin. In the opening and the first video of the series, we will establish why Paul is far from an apostle. Rather, he was a confused charlatan and an apostate in light of the teachings of none other than Paul himself. The book of Hebrews is associated with Paul, as alleged by the so-called church tradition. Its authorship is a whole separate topic. It's either argued that Paul himself wrote it, or one of his associates. So we'll save ourselves the headache for now, as it is a futile point if Paul himself directly or indirectly authored it, per the so-called church tradition. One could say the book of Hebrews was written to convince the Jews to not act Jewish anymore, which basically means to give up the Mosaic law, because Christ has done away and replaced it with something better, rendering the law basically useless. Let's read a few passages from the book of Hebrews to get an insight into the thought of Paul. He says in his letter to the Hebrews, chapter 9, verse 12, Jesus with his own blood, not the blood of goats and calves, entered the most holy place once for all time and secured our redemption forever. Then in Hebrews chapter 10 he states in verse 4, for it is not possible for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sins. Then in verse 10 he continues, for God's will was for us to be made holy by the sacrifice of the body of Jesus Christ once for all time. Continuing in verse 12, he says, but our high priest, meaning Jesus, offered himself to God as a single sacrifice for sins, good for all time. And finally, in verse 18, he states, and when sins have been forgiven, meaning after the redeeming death of Christ, there is no need to offer any more sacrifices. End quote. To give a summary of chapter 10, Paul is essentially providing his reasons as to why he considers the new covenant in Jesus Christ superior to the old covenant of animal sacrifices. He concludes by saying that Jesus' sacrifice was a perfect, once and for all times, solution to the old ways of sacrificing animals, which couldn't really atone the sins. The ultimate solution, namely the death of Christ, has been offered, and after it, there is no reason to practice the same old ways of sacrificing again. In Hebrews chapter 10, verse 22, Paul says, let's approach God with a sincere heart in full assurance of faith. In conclusion of everything so far we've read, the author puts the icing on the cake by saying that the sacrificial death of Christ brings complete assurance of faith. Now let's continue with the next part. After having examined the teachings of Paul on the so-called perfect sacrifice of Christ, we would expect him to live out his doctrines of salvation which he explained in the book of Hebrews, especially the one concerning the finality of Jesus Christ's death as the final atonement for the sins of mankind, for once and all. Does Paul let his actions speak for his teachings? Let's investigate. In Acts of the Apostles, chapter 21, Paul is recorded as having made a fulfillment of the Nazirite vow. The background story is that Paul was telling the Jewish Christians to apostatize from the law and abandon it. So when the disciples of Jesus heard of the charge, they commanded Paul to prove his innocence by showing his loyalty to the law through the fulfillment of a Nazirite vow. Let's read Acts chapter 21, verse 26. Then Paul took them in, and the next day, purifying himself with them, entered into the temple, to signify the accomplishment of the days of purification, until that an offering should be offered for every one of them. The Greek word for offering is prosphora, and on the screen you can see its definition. Christians might cope by saying the offering is not literal, but in the context of Acts 21, any non-literal usage of offering is impossible. Therefore, a bloody sacrifice is what's spoken of as the charge against Paul, was that of abandoning the literal practice of the law. That means he has to prove his innocence by observing the sacrifice literally, the nail in the coffin being, the verse mentions temple, which self-evidently involves the altar. Hence, the only option is that it's a literal blood offering. Knowing that Christians will continue to cope and remain in denial, let's look into the process of a Nazirite vow when it comes to the offering. We must look no further than the commandments surrounding the Nazirite vow, and these are recorded for us in the book of Numbers, chapter 6. We recommend you read the chapter for yourself, because we will be presenting a summary of it. The required offerings, as described in Numbers chapter 6, verses 13 to 21, that a Nazirite would make are the following: a lamb as a burnt offering, an ewe, meaning a female sheep, as a sin offering, a ram as a peace offering, as well as 3 additional offerings: a basket of unleavened bread, a grain offering, and a drink offering to accompany the peace offering. As it can be observed, what Paul teaches in the book of Hebrews is totally against his actions as recorded in Acts. From saying that the death of Jesus is the perfect sacrifice which nullifies all of the Mosaic law and replaces it with something better, to quite literally practicing the polar opposite of it. What seems to be the case is that Paul was either not really sure if the death of Jesus was enough to save him, therefore not a perfect sacrifice, or the book of Hebrews has nothing to do with Paul. Yet the so-called church tradition associates it with Paul. That means we are left with only one option. Paul exposed himself as a charlatan and lied in front of the disciples of Jesus to appease them. Because in Philippians chapter 3, verse 8, he describes the law of God given to Moses. Yes, the same law, he says in Hebrews, is not needed anymore, yet practices it in Acts 21 as garbage. Paul, in his own words, is a hypocrite, a deceiving man who blasphemes God. We have established that Paul still practiced the law even 30 years after the death of Jesus. We will conclude by presenting what the church father Ignatius has to say about those who still practice the law after Christ. Ignatius, in his letter to the Magnesians, in chapter 8, states the following: "Be not seduced by strange doctrines, nor by antiquated fables, which are profitless. For if even unto this day we live after the manner of Judaism, we avow that we have not received grace." End quote. In other words, Paul is an apostate who has not received the grace of salvation. Therefore, he is condemned to hell in light of what Ignatius has to say. وآخر دعوانا أن الحمد لله رب العالمين.